So I shall now hand over to Henry Creissen. So Henry is an applied plant pathologist and integrated pest management expert at SRUC. In addition to developing sustainable disease management strategies for arable crops, Henry also collaborates with social scientists to quantify the adoption of IPM practices and develop approaches to increase their uptake. So over to you, Henry.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Nicola, and thank you to the organisers for allowing me the pleasure of kicking off the talks today. I've been asked to give an introduction to IPM, which I'll do by talking about a project that we had involving several partners across the UK and Ireland, in which we set out a strategy to quantify IPM, which is obviously a very difficult thing to do because the amount of practices and tools and techniques that can be associated with IPM. So we focused on the arable sector because it's an area that we recognise as perhaps being underperformers in terms of IPM, certainly compared to protected horticultural edible crops. So IPM in the arable sector, what do we know now and what do we need to know? Well, digging into the literature, we found that there's very little information on the adoption of IPM practices and even less on the perception of IPM amongst arable growers. It's possible that familiarity of IPM is lower amongst arable growers, certainly compared to horticultural growers. So why do we need to know more? We need to establish baselines so we know what levels are being practiced now, so we can identify whether there's any improvements in terms of IPM uptake. Through the process, we can identify some of the barriers to uptake, and hopefully through targeted R&D and knowledge exchange activities, we can remedy this situation and overcome those hurdles. So how do we get this information? Well, it's very hard to find out what's being practiced on farm right now unless you speak to the farmers and the growers themselves. So this is what we did, and we decided the best approach would be to get a large amount of responses to allow for the statistical analysis, and this was by way of a questionnaire. This is roughly how the project was structured. So we did the literature review, which is all kinds of published scientific journals and grey literature, and particularly looking at the 8 principles of IPM as defined by the EU, so prevention, suppression, monitoring, decision-making, and non-chemical control measures, pesticide use and responsible pesticide use, anti-resistance strategies, and also evaluation. And that really informed the survey questions. We went through a lot of piloting of these survey questions with various agronomists and farmer groups. And then we set about creating a metric to assess the adoption of IPM practices. We collected the data, then analysed it, and through that I identified some drivers and barriers to IPM adoption. So the farmer survey was conducted across these 4 study countries: England, Scotland, Ireland, and Northern Ireland. And we tried to get a sample that was representative of the arable farming population. And originally from about 50 questions, we got it down to just over 20, 14 IPM questions and 8 socio-demographic questions on the farmer and the farm business. And this is so we could try to understand which groups were perhaps underperforming or performing well in terms of IPM adoption. Overall, it's quite a short survey, only taking about 10 minutes to complete. We had a total of 225 responses. The next challenge was how to develop a scoring system to capture the range of IPM practices being adopted. IPM is very much a holistic way of managing pests, and typically when we're talking about pests, and with this survey, we're talking about any harmful organisms excluding vertebrates, such as rodents and geese, for instance. So we decided the best way to actually agree on what best IPM practice was to assemble an expert group of stakeholders, largely advisors and farmers, but with some input from researchers, merchants, and policymakers as well. So we're capturing everyone that really has influence over IPM decisions on farm. We all gathered together in a workshop, about 12 of us, and sat down and discussed the merits of each of the questions, the 6 questions we pulled out relating to IPM practice. We scored each individual option on a 1 to 5 scale, and then we decided how important the overall question was, whether it was on rotation or variety selection, for example, on how much that should contribute to the overall IPM score, which with a bit of modification, we got it to be out of 100. So they're given a percentage score in terms of IPM practiced. We then sent out those workshop responses to about 50 odd other stakeholders across the 4 study countries, used their weights, their scores to create the final set of weights and the final IPM metric. These are the 6 questions that when amalgamated created the metric. So what proportion of your land is in continuous cereals, the reasons for adopting a rotation, influences on choice of variety, preventative measures to control weeds, diseases, invertebrate pests, and what factors you used when deciding on a pest management plan, and whether or not you were part of a discussion group. And this was the final set of weights we got. As you can see, a good chunk, almost half of the score was allocated towards preventative measures. Perhaps as it should be according to the guidelines as to what IPM practice should be. There's definitely an emphasis on prevention, suppression of pests, but also equally important, the reasons for adopting the rotation, how much rotation is actually being practiced, and the amount of factors considered when planning for an IPM program. As we've conducted this over 4 countries, we can start looking at some national differences in terms of IPM practice. So the score is out of 100. And as you can see here, the different letters denote whether the sample, whether there are significant differences or not. So England and Scotland, both receiving an A, are the same. They're both scoring very well in terms of IPM uptake, certainly better than Northern Ireland, and then the Republic of Ireland scoring the worst. So we know that there's a difference in terms of the overall level of IPM uptake, but what practices differ between the 4 study countries? When looking at soil cultivation, you'll see when looking at England in the green, there's a much higher likelihood of respondents in England adopting minimum tillage and perhaps occasionally using the plough in a rotational ploughing system. Whereas in the other study countries, Scotland, Ireland and Northern Ireland, the plough is heavily relied on for soil cultivations. Perhaps related to that is the fact that rotations are more heavily practiced under these minimum till scenarios. Anyone going down the conservation agriculture, regenerative agriculture route is likely to go for minimum soil disturbance, and as a result increase the length of rotations and the use of cover crops and things. And this was reflected when we asked how much of your land is in continuous cereals, so more than 5 years of cereals in the same field. In England, almost 80% said 0% of their land is in continuous cereals. And that's, as I said, related to the regenerative agriculture approach. But also the fact that there's more crops available to be grown in England because the environmental conditions are more favourable, but also markets are generally better as well for more crops. When asked for the reasons for rotation, they were asked to say whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement that rotations were to control weeds, diseases, other insects, pests and mollusks, improve soils or spread financial risks. In England, there's a much higher chance of them strongly agreeing with the reason for rotation being to control weeds, but also other pests, diseases and invertebrates as well. Perhaps unsurprisingly, certainly related to the past 3 slides, is the fact that blackgrass is cited as being the real problem pest in England, whereas in the other countries it barely gets a look in. You'll also notice that in Scotland and Ireland, brome, sterile brome, is considered more of a pest than the other two countries. And we're looking at weed prevention overall. By far and away, the most widely used practice for controlling weeds was the full inversion plough. And that was particularly due to the high likelihood of a plough system in Scotland, Ireland, and Northern Ireland. But also you'll see in England, there's a higher chance of stale seed beds being used because you've got more capacity to do that. There's usually a greater window between harvesting of one crop and sowing of the next crop to allow for that stale seed bed. And perhaps again related to the slight propensity to go for a minimum till route is the pre-emergence herbicide applications as well, being more popular in England than the other study countries. Okay, so now looking at IPM activities overall, we divided those samples into those low adopters, so the lower quartile, the lower quarter, in terms of the IPM score, and also the upper quartile, they were deemed the higher adopters. And we asked them about the importance of different IPM activities to them. So this is really a summary of each of the questions that we used. What you will notice here is that when comparing the high IPM adopters to the low IPM adopters, the high IPM adopters are considering many more factors when creating a pest management plan at the start of the season. They're also more likely to use more preventative measures, have more reasons for arable rotation, but also have less of their land in continuous cereals. But particularly when it comes to this planning, they're sitting down, they're considering all of the factors that might affect their pests and the management of them on farm. So now we really need to find out what's driving some of these differences. So we did another set of analysis where we looked at things like level familiarity with IPM. So this was a self-assessed question. Farmers were asked how familiar they are with IPM and on a 1 to 5 scale. And we found that that was significantly affecting IPM score, as was having a good relationship with your crop advisor, certainly as opposed to not having an advisor at all. Those higher adopters are also more likely to consider biological control methods as important, and they're also more likely to be of a larger farm area as well. And there could be many reasons for those of a large farm area having higher uptake of IPM. It could be they've got more land, it's allowing them to grow more different crops and have a better rotation. It could be they're more likely to have the labourer on site to actually conduct some of these detailed monitorings of pests populations. But they also may be more likely to have machinery to conduct some of the practices and also potentially buy in more advice. And we've seen there's a country effect as well. So we put in basically everything we could think of into this model. These are just the significant factors. So going back to that first question, how familiar are you with IPM on a 1 to 5 scale? And this broadly mirrors what we see and when we're looking at IPM score, with England and Scotland performing better than those on the island of Ireland. Particularly of interest is the fact that in Northern Ireland, familiarity with IPM can be very low, and it could be that perhaps the term is not as widely used in Northern Ireland as it is in the other countries. So the fact that familiarity had a strong influence on IPM uptake was seen when we looked at the entire sample, and you can see we've got a very significant relationship as we increase our familiarity with IPM, perceived familiarity with IPM. On the x-axis and on the bottom, we see an increase in IPM score. However, you'll see there's a lot of variation around this line. Some people who are very familiar with IPM are perhaps not practicing IPM to a high level. So if you look over to the bottom right of the chart, you'll see those deeming themselves to be very familiar, but the practice is not reflecting that. It could be that these people are restricted by the system that they're in, the soil that they've got, maybe not suitable for other crops. They might not have the access to the markets required to diversify. There could be a whole host of other farmer and farm business constraints there. Similarly, when we look at the top left of the chart, there's a disparity as well. So some of those that are citing familiarity of IPM as being pretty unfamiliar with IPM, so the 2s and the 1s, they're actually scoring IPM at a quite high level, so over 80%, some of them. And this, again, could be something due to issues surrounding the term IPM. They could be doing a lot of IPM practices, but not terming it IPM. Granted, this was a couple of years ago, so perhaps the term was less familiar across the board at that stage. So if we can improve familiarity, there's a good chance we can improve uptake. Obviously, there are other constraints such as farm size, which is harder to influence. How do we improve familiarity is the next question. So we asked them about their preferred information sources. We asked them to rank their top 3 IPM or pest management information sources. And this is what we found. We found that those who are attending crop walks and open days and speaking with their agronomist and having a good relationship with their agronomist were more likely to be highly familiar with IPM. On the other side of that, we have people that rely heavily on other farmers for IPM advice, typically seem to be less familiar with IPM. It could be an issue with the term, they're not using the term, but it could be that those farmers are receiving information secondhand through rather than speaking directly with the experts, the agronomists and the researchers and that they're involved in crop days and crop walks. So looking at how the high IPM adopters compared to the lower IPM adopters in terms of their preferred information source. The high IPM adopters certainly valued independent agronomists' advice more than the low adopters of IPM. Whereas the opposite is true for merchant agronomists, with those low IPM adopters being more likely to cite a merchant agronomist as one of their top 3 sources of IPM advice. We didn't make any assessment here about the quality of advice given from the different types of agronomists. There could be various factors in place here. It could be that those of a smaller farm, if it's a smaller farm business, less likely to adopt IPM to a higher level and more likely to just visit their merchant agronomist for all of their products and their advice rather than pay separately for advice from an independent agronomist. Also, there's a difference here in terms of the way that that farming press or other passive forms of information are received, whereas the low IPM groups put a higher value on a farming press than the higher IPM groups. And this is indicative across the board. Those that are actively seeking the current IPM advice and information are more likely to adopt IPM to a higher level than those that are simply sitting back and receiving the information. So there's just a one-way flow of information there. It's important to point out here that this is not all on the farmer's shoulders. It shouldn't be anyway. We need to improve IPM across the uptake across the supply chain. This is a workshop that we had held with some key stakeholders when we're talking about the barley supply chain. We've done it with other crops as well, such as potatoes. And we looked at all of those involved in IPM decisions or having any influence over IPM decisions. We looked at their relationships and tried to identify certain barriers to IPM uptake.
We've got a couple of minutes left, okay?
Sure, thank you. On this one, one thing that was pointing out as a potential barrier was the maltster, who's been quite restrictive in terms of the varieties they'll accept for spring barley, obviously. Really in Scotland, you're looking to sell 1 or 2 different varieties, and that's a decision that's been taken out of the farmer's hands. They may not be able to select the best varieties for their farm in terms of disease resistance and things. So in summary, we have a consistent conception of IPM. We did see that IPM practices varied over the samples with more rotation and min-till in England. All farmers had adopted IPM to some extent. We had a mean of 65% and the lowest was 27. When looking at the drivers, a good relationship with the advisor, considering biological control is important, being of a large farmed area and having high familiarity with IPM is more likely to improve uptake. Those high adopters are the ones that are actively seeking IPM knowledge through crop walks and open days and discussion groups. But IPM adoption is the responsibility of all stakeholders. That survey that I've just talked about is now being adapted by the voluntary initiative in the NFU and will be the new revised IPM plans for England. It's been adapted to cover field, veg and forage crops as well, but we also need to develop something similar in terms of the survey and a metric for those that only grow grass. And that's where we really need your help. So anyone who would be interested in being involved in creating the IPM plan for grasslands, please do contact me via email or via the phone number below, as we're looking certainly in the next couple of weeks to get some more input into that draft and set about having a workshop to create a metric for grasslands, which in grasslands is pretty much weed management is the only thing we're looking at. These are the sorts of questions we have that we'll be scoring about prevention of spread of weeds on the farm and the factors influencing the decisions to spray. But yes, please do get in contact. So going forward, we have this system in place to monitor changes in IPM practice. We must make sure that our KTE, our knowledge transfer and exchange, is clear and consistent and evidence-based, and that evidence must be from impartial and trusted resources. We also need to be pushing more IPM R&D in terms of combinations of non-chemical and chemical control measures. Obviously, these recommendations must be practical and feasible. We do need to encourage that decision maker to actively engage, and there's various carrots and sticks we can use to do that. And again, we need to be looking at improving IPM uptake, and it's a responsibility of the whole supply chain there. Whether there could be premiums for IPM produced food is one potential option. And with that, I'd like to finish and thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Henry.